Have you heard this advice? Use what you already know. You've learned Spanish in school maybe, so French is going to be easier. Or maybe you did French in school, so Italian will be a breeze because don't they have a lot of the same vocabulary or a lot of the same structures? There are secrets polyglots know, but don't always share with you. And today we're going to look at one of those, which is the existence of exceptions. The small number of things that might trip you up if you rely too heavily on what you've already learned. Stay tuned and we'll see some of the differences between related languages. When you train to be a teacher, you're always told to begin a lesson by activating what students already know, the kind of schemata that they have laid down in their minds. So it's true in a sense that you learn by connecting to what you already know. Sometimes, however, and particularly in second, third or fourth language learning, that can also create a kind of interference if you rely too heavily on what you know from another situation. We're going to look at how far you can rely on what you already know when it comes to things like grammatical gender. I'm going to talk specifically about Romance languages. Not all of them, because I'm only familiar with a few. What got me thinking about this was watching a video by Steve Kaufman. A very interesting video in which he's discussing Mark Carney's level of French, the new Canadian leader, and how well he does or doesn't speak French, which is quite crucial in his new situation. In that video, which is a very useful guide for looking at what does or doesn't matter when you're improving your knowledge of a language, there's a point where Kaufman says that if he's stuck on a gender or can't remember a gender in French, he can fall back on his Spanish. And the examples that he uses are the French word grammaire, which looks in some ways to an English speaker, if you've learned words like le maire, the mayor of a town, it looks like it might be masculine, but in fact it's feminine, la grammaire. And he uses his knowledge of Spanish, la gramática, to tell him, okay, remember it ends in an A in Spanish, so it's a feminine word. And the other example, he uses a masculine word, vocabulaire, but in Spanish that is el vocabulario. So that's how he reminds himself it's masculine. Now this is a great way to rely on what you already know from another context. And it's true, of course, that those languages are closely related. They descend from a common ancestor with lots of changes along the way. But what you may not know, and what Kaufman in that particular video doesn't mention, he probably mentions it elsewhere, is that there are, as always, exceptions to this. We can't assume that because two languages developed from the same ancestor, the gender of a noun will always be the same. Now, when it comes to Romance languages, it seems it mostly is. So most of the time, if you're stuck, you know some Spanish or some French that you learned in school and now you're learning the other one, or perhaps some Italian, you can try it. You can tell me about similar occurrences in other Romance languages if you know them. Sometimes that word will have gone through a different history and will end up with a different gender. Now, some examples. The word for flower in French, as in a bloom, a flower, la fleur, is in Italian il fiore. Now, they're very similar words in other ways, but one is feminine, la fleur, and the other is masculine, il fiore. I could go on giving examples. Let's look at, say, French and Spanish. Le lait, the milk, le lait de soja, if you want soy milk, la leche in Spanish, masculine in French, feminine in Spanish. La couleur in French, colour, is el color in Spanish. It seems that in Spanish, a lot of abstract nouns that end in OR actually will be masculine, which is not always the case in French. So my focusing on these differences may make it seem as if there's total chaos here and that you can't ever rely on it. Steve Kaufman isn't wrong. Most of the time, if you draw on what you already know from one Romance language, for example, and this holds for other sets of languages that are closely related, you will find the similarity will help you. It can be a good backup if you're already speaking and you can't remember, but you just need to know that it's not always the case. It won't be a disaster if you get it wrong. as I've often said before, getting the gender wrong, even at a level where people speak really well in a foreign language, can still happen and doesn't destroy communication. If you're interested in knowing more about this, or in reading some lists of examples and some of the other Romance language examples as well, you can find it in two sources, at least two sources. One by Ruth Jackson Volman from 1959. It's just a one-page article on her research on this with a small sample of words. Or in an unpublished paper by Ingrid Morales and Mark Skandera from 2024 that is available online. So I'll put the links to those below. What I'd like to know from you, particularly if you speak other Romance languages like maybe Portuguese or maybe Romanian or any of the others, to hear of similar differences. Let me know also about other differences and other ways you've found that perhaps your languages help each other or maybe interfere with each other. I'll just give one last example there. When I was learning Italian at university many, many years ago, the teacher mentioned she could always tell those of us who had studied French previously because we tended to pronounce Italian verbs with a slight French sound, saying mangiare, to eat, as mangiare, with a j and an on sound from French. That was the example that has stayed something like 30 years in my mind, or maybe 40 years by now. So that's another kind of interference, and we'll talk about that in another video. But let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Language Learning Life.